Hello and welcome to another video. Today we'll be taking a look at the Kazakh Famine. We'll be taking a look at what it was, why it was done, why it was caused, who was there, so who was involved, who were the perpetrators and who were the victims. We'll look at the consequences, we'll look at some books about the famine as well as some quotes. First of all, let's take a look at what this famine actually was. First of all, the definition. The Kazakh famine from 1930 to 1933 was a catastrophic famine that led to the death of approximately 1.5 to 2 million people, primarily ethnic Kazakhs, constituting about 38% of the Kazakh population at that time. Now let's take a look at the geographical scope. Well, this famine affected the Kazakh Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic, which is nowadays Kazakhstan but was at that time part of the Soviet Union. The famine also resulted in the decimation of traditional nomadic pastoralism, the destruction of livestock-based economy, and severe depopulation of rural areas, so it had some big economic and social impacts. There was also an agricultural collapse because the famine caused massive reduction in agricultural output, leading to widespread starvation and diseases as well. There was also a lot of cultural loss. There was significant erosion of Kazakh culture, as many traditional practices and ways of life were abandoned in the struggle for survival. Now let's take a look at why it was done and by whom. Well, the famine was largely a result of Soviet policies, particularly forced collectivization and sedentarization of nomadic Kazakhs. There was also under Stalin a collectivization campaign which disrupted traditional pastoral practices. Livestock was forcibly confiscated and herded into collective farms, so-called kolkhozes. They were often mismanaged and there was a sharp decline in productivity. There was also sedentarization. The Soviet authorities aimed to transfer the nomadic lifestyle of Kazakhs into settled agricultural farming, disregarding their traditional knowledge and ecological adaptation. There was also a lot of grain procurement. There was excessive grain procurement quotas were imposed on Kazakhstan, and much of the collected grain was exported to fund industrialization in the bigger cities of the Soviet Union, and especially like in the north. Just all of the corn and grain was taken away from Kazakhstan. There was also some political repression. Resistance to these policies was met with harsh repression, including arrests, execution, and deportations of dissenters and community leaders. This was especially true for Kazakh leaders, who were of course opposed to this idea of collectivization and, for that matter, also of course the famine as a whole. There was also a lot of ignorance and indifference from the Soviet authorities, who displayed a combination of ignorance towards the local ecological conditions and indifference to the suffering of the Kazakh people. On this note, one has to say that after a while they did bring in some help. They brought in doctors, they brought in some food, but for a long while it was their fault and they didn't really do anything. Now, let's look at who was there, so who was involved in this famine. First of all, of course, the Kazakh nomads. The primary victims were the ethnic Kazakhs, traditionally nomadic herders, who suffered the most from the loss of their livestock and the forced changes to their way of life. Soviet officials were of course also involved. Local and regional Soviet officials were responsible for implementing Stalin's policies. Stalin was the, let's say, boss of the Soviet Union at that time, and he was the one who, well, in one way or another, ordered this famine. Many of these officials lacked understanding of the local environment and economy because they weren't from the region. They were often assigned, for example, by Stalin to the region. There were also some intellectuals and elites who were involved. Kazakh intellectuals and elites who opposed collectivization and sedentarization faced arrest, execution, or exile, further destabilizing Kazakh society. But there were of course also some survivors. Survivors of the famine include those who managed to adapt to the new conditions, those who migrated to other regions, and those who participated in the Soviet economy after the famine ended. Now let's take a look at the consequences. Of course, first of all, there were demographic changes. The famine led to a dramatic population decline, with a significant proportion of the Kazakh population perishing or fleeing to neighboring regions. Another problem was the economic ruin. The destruction of the livestock population devastated the traditional Kazakh economy, leading to long-term economic hardship. There was also a cultural disruption. Traditional Kazakh culture and social structures were profoundly disrupted. The loss of nomadic practices and the forced sedentarization changed the cultural landscape of Kazakhstan. Of course, among the population there was also a long-term trauma that, continues on to this day. The famine left a legacy of trauma among the survivors and their descendants, influencing Kazakhstan's historical memory and identity. On this note, one has to say that thinking about or discussing about this topic of the famine was for a long time not permitted in the Soviet Union, but nowadays there is actually a sort of a remembrance culture and people are allowed to talk, discuss, and things like that about the famine. There was also some political repercussions. The famine contributed to deep-seated mistrust and resentment towards Soviet authorities, which persisted even after Kazakhstan gained independence in 1991. Now, let's take a look at some books about the famine. First up is The Hungry Steppe: Famine, Violence, and the Making of Soviet Kazakhstan by Sarah Cameron. She wrote this book in 2018. It provides a detailed examination of the Kazakh famine within the broader context of Soviet policy and its violent repercussions on Kazakh society. Next up is Stalin's Nomads: Power and Famine in Kazakhstan by Robert Kindler. He wrote this book in 2018. It explores the impact of Soviet policy on Kazakh nomads, offering insights into the tragic consequences of collectivization and forced sedentarization. Nomads and the Soviet Rule: Central Asia under Lenin and Stalin by Alun Thomas. This book discusses the transformation of Central Asian nomadic societies under Soviet rule, including the Kazakh famine, but of course not only the Kazakh famine. Next up is Soviet and Muslim: The Institutionalization of Islam in Central Asia by Iran Tazar. It provides context on the broader Soviet policies towards Muslim communities in Central Asia, including the effects on Kazakh nomadic life and culture. So this book is not directly on the famine, but rather how the Kazakh population was influenced in other ways by the Soviet power, or the Soviet government. Stalin's War on Ukraine: The Holodomor and Its Consequences by Anne Applebaum. It focuses on the Ukrainian Holodomor, but it also provides valuable comparisons and insights into the Soviet-induced famines, also including the Kazakhstan famine. Now, last up are some quotes about the famine. First of all, we have Sarah Cameron. She says, "The Kazakh famine was not simply a natural disaster, but a human-made catastrophe deeply intertwined with the Soviet regime's goals of social transformation and control." Next up is Robert Kindler. The Soviet project in Kazakhstan aimed to obliterate nomadic pastoralism, but it resulted in a catastrophe that decimated the population and destroyed a way of life. Next up is Anne Applebaum. The Kazakh famine, like the Ukrainian Holodomor, was a result of deliberate policies and the brutal indifference to human suffering on the part of Soviet authorities. Second to last is Martha Brill Olcott. She stated, "The trauma of the Kazakh famine has left an indelible mark on the collective memory of the Kazakh people, shaping their post-Soviet identity and historical narrative." Last of all is Nursultan Nazarbayev. He says, "The memory of the famine and the suffering endured by our ancestors is a crucial part of our national history, reminding us of the resilience and strength of the Kazakh people." Thank you for listening.